Well, hi guys. I wanted to talk to you real quick about American History 1. I know we're in American History 2, but a lot of times we miss out on something, and the way that this is supposed to work, you were supposed to have American History 1 and then American History 2, and it just didn't happen. So I do want to just start with a recap. It's not going to take long, and I want to just hit some highlights. And one of the reasons that highlights are important is they're called watershed moments. Now, watershed, if you ever have seen a bathtub ring, right? Water sits for a certain amount of time, and then if it goes down or even if it goes up, it leaves kind of like a film, a ring around it. And you can see this really in geology, where you can see the rings of where water events have happened. And these are what we call watershed moments, and they leave a mark. They leave uh, an impact on the world around them, and you can view them. Right now, the COVID-19 coronavirus, this is a watershed moment. We're going to say pre-COVID or post-COVID. Hopefully soon we'll say post-COVID. And this will be the defining moment in our history. 9/11, defining moment. World War II. Now, I know that I don't want you to always know about dates, and dates are important. You really do need to know where some of those things are, because they're reference points. This happened after this, or this happened before this. So, for example, we talk about the antebellum South. Now, ante means before, and bellum means war. So the pre-war South, and we're referring to the Civil War, and the Civil War is 1861. So that is a defining moment. So you can go after the Civil War, which happened in 1865, because you got 4 years, right? And before the Civil War, and that's 1861. So that's a defining moment. That's a point of reference for us. Okay, so a lot of times wars are those points of reference for us as just defining moments. So I just want to go through a couple of the highlights, the really big ones. All right, so 1492, that's kind of like the big one. Columbus sailed the ocean blue, right? 1492, and he discovers America. Oh, did he? Okay, so he maybe discovers the area of America, in the West Indies and that kind of stuff. And so there's some debate there about what he actually discovered, and of course when he discovered it, and should be given credit for all that. But big picture is 1492, all right? So we're jumping forward about 100 and something years to 1607. Now, 1607 is kind of another defining moment, because that's the settlement of Jamestown, right? So we got settlement of Jamestown. This is when you got a lot of exploration happening, but then a lot of settlers, people that are staying here. And of course, this is where a lot of people start coming, and you got the immigration of a bunch of people, not just from Europe, although a lot primarily from Europe, but you've got that. And of course, quickly after that, you have unfortunately the slave trade that starts to be a big part of that, and we'll talk about that. There's that triangular trade, the Columbian Exchange, and all that. Okay, so 1620, the Plymouth colony comes in, and they also set up shop a little bit more in northern England. Then you jump ahead quite a few years. I mean, we're talking, 100 years. So you got 1763, and there's two, technically three, Treaty of Paris's. Apparently everybody wants to go to Paris to sign a treaty. So you've got the Treaty of Paris of 1763, and that ends the 7 Years' War, which technically lasted 9 years. But, hey, who's counting? I'm not good at math either. So you've got the 7 Years' War that happens. This is also called the French and Indian War. We're more familiar with that term. So French and Indian War happens over here. It's England, France, all that kind of stuff. We're back and forth. And why this is a watershed moment for us is because from that point, England, kind of didn't really treat America as a full-fledged member of society. And so at that point, they tried to do some stuff that we had what was called salutary neglect, where they just kind of forgot about us and like, yeah, hey guys, you guys are over there. We need your stuff. We need all your we call it mercantilism. We need all your goods, and we need you to buy stuff, but we need to also tax you, because we're now in debt, because England just kind of went across the world and just started to conquer people. So they needed a lot of taxes. And America went, oh, no way, Jose, I ain't paying any taxes. And that's where you get the representation without, or taxation without representation. All right, so 1775. All right, so a couple of years after this, Bunker Hill happens, right? This is the Battle of Bunker Hill. In this, we have the battle, some other small little skirmishes, the shot heard round the world, that kind of stuff. And at this point, right, the Declaration hasn't been signed yet, hasn't even been declared. So you've got just a small little mom pop, Minutemen kind of people popping up and saying, "I don't like you, Britain." That's the whole thing, all right? And so you now have this feeling like, hey, there's something rising up a little bit, and we're going to fight for our rights. All right, so the Boston Tea Party hasn't happened, the Boston Massacre hasn't happened, none of that. All right, so 1775 is when that Battle of Bunker Hill. 1 year later, 1776. Pretty important date to that watershed moment, right? Declaration of Independence. So you can put your foot on that one. 1776. That is a line in the sand or the bathtub of what's going on. So 1776 is huge. All right. And then you've got 1783. So we fight a war. We've got a lot of stuff happening. And so at that point, we've got, oh, well, wait a second. Boston Massacre is 1770, 1773, that kind of stuff. And then I'm looking on my stuff over here, make sure I'm all on the same page. So Treaty of Paris, 1783, is 20 years. Only 20 years have gone by from the Treaty of Paris, French and Indian War in 1763 to the Treaty of Paris that ends the American Revolution, 1783. Okay, so that's where we are on that. 1787, we have a constitutional convention. Now, we instituted what was called the Articles of Confederation, and they didn't work out so well. Lots of people upset about that. Lots of people didn't want the government to have a lot of power, and people kind of, they were frustrated with that. And then you talked about, okay, well, how do you count people that are slaves? Because you've got a larger number of people in the northern regions and not the southern regions, although there was a lot of slaves. And how do you count it? You call the two-thirds compromise, or I'm sorry, the three-fifths compromise, and sometimes called the Great Compromise. This is where you get the idea of the bicameral legislation. So you got the House and the Senate and all that kind of stuff. All right, so all that stuff happens. All right, so 1789, George Washington becomes our first president. Woohoo, go George. All right, now there's not a lot of people on here, this list, because they're not really watershed moments. All right, there's a few, but Washington kind of sets the bar because he sets how a president is going to be elected, how a president is going to be called. I mean, what do you call him? Mr. like guy, person? He actually says, I'm going to be called Mr. President. All right, so that's pretty cool. So, and then in 1803, we got another pretty big watershed moment. This is called the Louisiana Purchase, and it happens in Thomas Jefferson time period. And he had to figure out whether or not it was legal, constitutional to, buy all this land without the government approval, without congressional approval. And so he actually was kind of went against his own thought process. Now, if you've ever watched the movie Hamilton or the show Hamilton, and I highly recommend you do, Hamilton kind of talks a little bit about Jefferson and his impact on the beginning of the world. And of course, there's a lot of things that Jefferson did that was right, and a lot of things that he did that was not so right. Obviously, he owned slaves. He had a lot of different things that he got involved in, and there was some back and forth political wise. Okay, so Jefferson buys Louisiana or purchases Louisiana, and not just Louisiana, but purchases big part of what was France's territory, and he literally doubles the size of the United States. And this is just a massive amount of land. Of course, it sets up a lot of issues with the Native Americans. Settlers move west, and it sets up a lot of stuff. You've got the idea of, okay, what happens to new states? Are they going to be slave? Are they going to be free? Slavery is, of course, a big part of whether or not this is going to be continuing and how that all works. And of course, we're going to get into that a little bit later. All right, so 1814, we have what's called the Treaty of Ghent. And this treaty, it basically ends the War of 1812. Again, we name things really, really well. But there's a battle after the Treaty of Ghent that's signed, and it's in 1815. And this is the Battle of New Orleans. And this really elevates Andrew Jackson as kind of a leader of the Americas, right? And of course, he later on becomes president. But it sets up what we call the era of good feelings. Now, this era of good feelings is you got nationalism and then you got sectionalism, and people are very excited about this new country, but they're also very divided, right? And it's based on economics, it's based on their perceptions of different things, it's based on their views on slavery. All these things are nationalism versus sectionalism stuff. Okay, 1820, we've got a Missouri Compromise, and this Missouri Compromise sets this line all the way across Missouri, which doesn't go above Missouri, actually go below Missouri, but says Missouri, who's above the line, can be a slave state. And it's all about balance of power, right? So it's all about who is going to be in power and who is going to be able to rule in the legislature. And we want that balance, especially in the Senate. That's really huge, because House is more about the representation of the people, but there's, you know, 2 senators for each state, and so you're trying to do the balance of power thing. All right, so Texas Revolution begins 15 years later. Guys, only 15 years is the Texas Revolution, and this is a big deal. Texas has basically becomes what we call the Lone Star Republic, not a state yet. This is where we get the remember the Alamo, you know, the Davy Crockett. If you've never seen Davy Crockett, you got to go watch it. All right, Davy Crockett's one of my heroes. But this is when they have the Alamo. Texas earns its independence from Mexico. And then quickly, America scarfs up Texas, and Mexico goes, oh no, you can't do that. And so we have the Mexican-American War, right, just a few years later, which happens in 1846. All right, during this time, got a lot of other stuff going on. We got 1848, we got the gold rush, California gold rush is happening, and this is huge, because what it does is moves a lot of people very quickly towards the west, right? And there's a lot of different things that happen when you have massive amounts of people. You have to have massive amounts of infrastructure. So you have to have ways to get out there. You have to have places to eat, places to sleep, all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of that economic buildup happens. All right. So 1850. This is when it really starts to hit the fan on people feeling like something is really about to start bad. And this is what we call Bleeding Kansas, and where new states, that this movement west, new states have had this issue with people coming over into their state and voting. And this state wants to be a slave state. This state wants to be a free state. We have the idea of popular sovereignty, which means, hey, the people can decide. Not necessarily. Let's just say, can we all agree on something? If I sat in a Zoom meeting, would you all agree on, you know, the best flavor of ice cream is, like, you know, chocolate? Probably not. All right. And so there's a big issue that happens. Now, one of the key guys that comes out in this time is a guy named John Brown. All right. And he does some pretty bad stuff, but he is an abolitionist to the core, meaning that he wants to remove slavery, right? He does not want slavery, and he's willing to fight and die for that belief. And he eventually does die. There's what's called the Harper's Ferry raid, and it's in West Virginia. Technically it was in Virginia, but it's now in West Virginia, because during the Civil War, West Virginia split off from Virginia, which is why we have West Virginia. And so John Brown, at the Harper's Ferry, he takes over, and he thinks that, hey, people are going to rise up with me. They don't. He is captured, he is hung, but he is still a martyr. And this brings up the idea of whether or not, you know, domestic terrorism, and this really does impact even today, guys. Is it okay to destruct things in order to protest? And it's huge, right? And so, you know, it's not just a recent occurrence. What you need to understand, history is cyclical. Things come back around, and the same mentality, the same ideas, they just get regurgitated out, right? If we don't fix these things, we need to address them. All right. So 1859, John Brown's raid. Of course, just a year later, Abraham Lincoln wins the election. And he gets almost no Southern votes. Matter of fact, he wasn't even on the Southern a ballot in some states. All right, so he gets elected president. Immediately, South Carolina secedes, says no way, we're out of here, and then others follow suit. And then, of course, in 1861 at Fort Sumter, South Carolina bombs their own base that had Northern troops in it. All right, so that's how Fort Sumter had happened. And of course, that is the start of the Civil War. It lasts for 4 years. Bloody battle. A lot of people think it's over states' rights, and yes, there's a part of that. A lot of people think it's over slavery, and yes, it's a big part of that. You can look at the writings of the South and realize that it is a big part of this, but you need to understand that not everybody in the South actually owned slaves, right? And there was a something about the South that said we're going to fight, but we're not really sure what we're fighting for. Same thing happens in the North, and so we'll revisit a lot of that when we get into the era that we're going to be talking about soon, and of course then the civil rights era, most definitely. Okay, so 1862, you got to remember, during the middle of the Civil War, the government needs money. They also have a lot of land now because that land has kind of grown, because you had in after the Texas Revolution, the Mexican-American War, you have what's called the Mexican Cession. And so it literally takes the entire bit pretty much of the United States, and this is it, all right? And so you've got a lot of land. So the government, the Northern government, starts selling the land. It's called the Homestead Act. And you got a lot of people that are moving out towards the Midwest and the West. All right, so you've got 1863. You got the Gettysburg Address, pretty famous address that Abraham Lincoln gets up there. This is the turning point. The battle itself was the turning point of the Civil War. If Gettysburg had been lost, we would not be in the same country that we are today. But he gets up there, cities to Gettysburg, fourscore, and that kind of stuff, and says, "Hey, we've got to come back together." Right? So a year and a half later, eventually, I don't know if you know this, but the Battle of Bentonville, which is just right up the road, I guess about 35 minutes from here. That was one of the last major battles of the Civil War, and it was a defeat for the Confederacy. Just shortly thereafter, you've got the end of the Civil War, the signing of hey, we're done. But then, just unfortunately, a few days later, Lincoln is shot. Now, I say unfortunately because he had already had plans of how this reconstruction was going to work, how to get back the Confederacy into the Union, to join back up the Union, and to do all that. And he is shot by a Southern sympathizer, John Wilkes Booth, and he is, it would have been completely different. And that's the whole what if scenario. What if some of these things hadn't have happened? And so 1865, Lincoln is shot, and his vice president comes in, Andrew Johnson. He kind of makes a mess of things. Grant comes in. Matter of fact, Andrew Johnson is our first president to be impeached, although not removed from office. So we've had 3 presidents now impeached, but 3 presidents not removed from office. And so you've got Ulysses S. Grant. He comes in and says, hey, we need to figure out some of this stuff. But you also have the rest of the United States starting to happen. So in 1867, you got this purchase of a very, very small bit of land called Alaska. Yeah, okay. So a big part of land, and honestly, almost doubles the United States again. And by the way, on a map, Alaska is not down at the bottom. Alaska is up top. But I know on the map, you look at it down, but it's not in scale. It is only about 3 miles from Russia. All right, so just understand that. Look at a map and look at a globe. Kind of help you out to understand that. So you got 1867, the purchase of Alaska. 1869, you've got the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, and guys, this is huge. It's a promontory point. They come to a head, the Golden Spike, and all of a sudden now you have coast to coast ability to get there in literally a matter of days, where it took months before, right? The trails and the Oregon Trail and all that kind of stuff. So you've got this now massive infrastructure, and you've got communication, you've got transportation, this sets up what we have in our country today, right? This is huge. All right. So you've also got some issues happening with the Native Americans. You've got the Indian Wars. One of the biggest things you've got, you've got in 1876, you got the Battle of Little Bighorn, and then just in 1890. And you've got the Battle of Wounded Knee, 1896, Battle of Wounded Knee, which pretty much ends the resistance as it was in Native Americans. Of course, Native Americans were treated horribly, especially the Cherokee Indians during the Trail of Tears back in the early 1800s. And again, we'll talk about how that all impacts and the horrible things that America has done and maybe continues to do, but we need to understand is that there are some good things, so there's always a balance. You can't look at one over the other. You always have to have a balance. So that's just my big thing. We're going to look at both sides. We're going to look at all sides because there's more than just one side of something. Last but not least, we're going to end with the 1877. This is the end of Reconstruction, and this kind of there were some great things that happened after Reconstruction, especially for African Americans, and then all of a sudden, and a lot of it has to do with finances and some different things, but basically the bottom line is there was a agreement that the South would really come back into the Union, especially in the legislature, and it really did enact what we call back into the Jim Crow law era. We'll be talking more about that in our new unit. All right, so that is in a nutshell this American History 1. I know it's a long video, but I wanted you to understand how this shaped, all right? And just so we hit the highlights, we'll call them watershed moments, and we'll be talking more about watershed moments as we go, all right? So here we go. We are getting ready to go to Unit 1 of American History 2, and I'll see you there.